2012, Iran's currency lost half its value in a single week. Not because of war, not because of revolution, because a handful of people in Washington and Brussels decided to flip a switch. They didn't fire a missile. They didn't send troops. They just removed Iran from the global banking system. And within days, ordinary Iranians couldn't buy medicine, couldn't import food, couldn't get paid for the oil they were selling. This is what modern warfare looks like. Silent, bureaucratic, devastating. And it's happening right now to more countries than you think. Here's what most people imagine when they hear economic sanctions. A country does something bad, other countries refuse to trade with them, pressure builds, behavior changes. Clean, moral, effective. Here's what actually happens. Let's start with the machinery, because sanctions aren't just about refusing to buy Russian oil or Venezuelan gold. They're about weaponizing something most people never think about, the infrastructure of global money. Every time money crosses a border, it doesn't just teleport from one bank account to another. It moves through a network, a system, and that system has choke points. The biggest choke point? SWIFT. SWIFT isn't a bank, it's a messaging system, a glorified email network for financial institutions. When a bank in Tokyo wants to send money to a bank in London, SWIFT is how they communicate the details. Who's sending, who's receiving, how much? Sounds boring. Sounds technical. But here's the thing, almost every major international transaction flows through SWIFT. Which means if you get kicked off SWIFT, you're essentially cut off from the modern financial world. And who controls SWIFT? Technically, it's a Belgian cooperative. Politically, the US and EU have the leverage to decide who gets access. So when Iran got removed from SWIFT in 2012, it wasn't just symbolic. It was logistical amputation. Iranian banks couldn't communicate with foreign banks, which meant Iranian businesses couldn't pay for imports, couldn't receive payment for exports. The entire economy seized up like an engine without oil. But SWIFT is just one layer. There's also the dollar problem. See, most global trade happens in US dollars. Not because everyone loves America, because it's stable, liquid, and everyone else is already using it. Oil contracts, dollars. International loans, dollars. Currency reserves, mostly dollars. Which means most international transactions, even between two countries that aren't the US, eventually touch the American financial system. And the US has made it very clear. If you do business with a sanctioned entity, you lose access to US markets. To US banks, to the dollar system. This is called secondary sanctions, and it's wildly effective. Imagine you're a European company. You could sell machinery to Iran and make a profit. But if you do, the US could freeze your American assets, ban you from US markets, cut you off from dollar clearing. So you don't. The risk isn't worth it. This is how sanctions work in practice. Not through direct force, through the architecture of modern finance, through the silent coercion of simply being plugged into a system someone else controls. Let's talk numbers, because sanctions aren't abstract. They have body counts. GDP counts, poverty counts. Take Iraq in the 1990s. After the Gulf War, the UN imposed some of the most comprehensive sanctions in modern history. The goal was to pressure Saddam Hussein into compliance. What actually happened? Iraq's GDP collapsed by more than 75% over the course of the decade. Infant mortality doubled. Malnutrition became widespread. Medical supplies vanished. A 1999 UNICEF study estimated that 500,000 Iraqi children under 5 died as a result of sanctions-related deprivation. 500,000. Now, you can argue about methodology. You can argue about who's really responsible. But here's the uncomfortable truth. The sanctions didn't remove Saddam Hussein from power. They didn't change his behavior. They just killed a lot of people who had nothing to do with the decision-making. Or look at Venezuela. U.S. sanctions began ramping up in 2017, targeting the state oil company and restricting access to international finance. The stated goal was to pressure the Maduro regime. The economy imploded. Oil production, which was already declining, cratered. Inflation hit 1,000,000%. Hospitals ran out of basic supplies. Millions fled the country. A 2019 study estimated that sanctions contributed to 40,000 deaths between 2017 and 2018 alone. Did Maduro step down? No. He's still there. Now here's where it gets tricky. These countries were already mismanaged, already authoritarian, already economically fragile. Sanctions didn't create those problems, but they didn't solve them either. They just accelerated the collapse. And the people who suffered most weren't the elites, they were the powerless. Because here's the dirty secret of sanctions. Authoritarian regimes are really good at insulating themselves. When Venezuela's economy collapsed, Maduro didn't go hungry. His inner circle didn't lose access to luxury goods. They just redirected what little resources remained toward themselves. The sanctions created scarcity, and scarcity gave the regime more control, more leverage, more ability to decide who eats and who doesn't. This is the paradox. Sanctions are supposed to empower the population to rise up, to demand change. But in practice, they often do the opposite. They weaken civil society. They make people more dependent on the state. They create conditions where survival becomes the only priority. But maybe you're thinking, okay, sanctions hurt ordinary people, but they also hurt the regime's ability to function. They cut off funding, they limit options. Do they? Let's talk about evasion. Because the thing about sanctions is that they create an entire shadow economy, a black market for international finance. Take Iran again. When Iran got cut off from SWIFT, it didn't just shut down its economy and surrender. It got creative. It started using front companies, shell corporations in Turkey, the UAE, China. Money would flow through a maze of intermediaries, each one technically compliant, collectively circumventing the restrictions. It started bartering oil for goods. Gold for medicine, no dollars required. It started working with countries that didn't care about US sanctions. China kept buying Iranian oil, just at a discount. Russia provided financial infrastructure. North Korea traded missile technology. The sanctions didn't stop the activity. They just made it more expensive, more complicated, more criminal. And here's the irony that made things worse. Because when you force an economy into the shadows, you lose transparency. You lose oversight. You create conditions where corruption thrives, where extremism finds funding, where the worst actors have the most freedom. North Korea is the extreme example. Sanctioned for decades, North Korea has built one of the most sophisticated sanction evasion networks in the world. Ship-to-ship transfers of oil in international waters, cyber heists, stealing hundreds of millions from foreign banks, cryptocurrency laundering. The sanctions didn't stop North Korea from building nuclear weapons. They just forced North Korea to get better at crime. So why do countries keep using sanctions if they're so ineffective? Because they're politically convenient. Sanctions let governments look tough without actually going to war. They signal disapproval. They satisfy domestic audiences who want action. And they're cheap. Relative to military intervention, sanctions cost almost nothing. You don't need to deploy troops. You don't need to risk American lives. You just update a list of names and entities. But there's a darker calculation happening. Sometimes sanctions aren't really about changing behavior. They're about containment, about making an adversary weaker, poorer, less able to project power. In that context, the humanitarian cost is just accepted. Not advertised, but accepted. Look at the sanctions on Russia after the invasion of Ukraine. The goal, publicly, was to pressure Russia into withdrawing. The goal, realistically, was to degrade Russia's ability to sustain a long-term military campaign. And in that sense, they're working. Russia's economy is shrinking. Its access to advanced technology is restricted. Its ability to finance the war is constrained. But will that end the war? Unclear. What's clear is that ordinary Russians are poorer, that inflation is eroding living standards, that access to foreign goods has disappeared. And Putin? Still in power, still waging war, because authoritarian leaders don't face the same political pressures democratic leaders do. They don't need to win elections. They don't need public approval. They can endure economic pain indefinitely as long as they maintain control of the security apparatus. Which brings us to the real question. Are sanctions a tool of justice or just a tool? Let's zoom out, because the long-term consequences of sanctions go way beyond the target country. Every time the US uses the dollar as a weapon, other countries take note. China's been watching, Russia's been watching, India, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, they're all watching. And they're all thinking the same thing. We need an alternative. This is why you're seeing the rise of BRICS currency discussions, why China is pushing the yuan for international trade, why countries are increasingly settling oil contracts in non-dollar currencies. The weaponization of the dollar is slowly eroding its dominance. And if the dollar loses its status as the global reserve currency, the US loses an enormous amount of economic and political power. Right now, the US can run massive deficits because the whole world needs dollars. Countries buy US Treasury bonds not because they're great investments, but because they need dollars for trade. If that demand disappears, US borrowing costs go up. Inflation becomes harder to control. The entire economic model shifts. So, in a weird way, sanctions might end up undermining the very system that makes them effective in the first place. It's a slow-motion unraveling, but it's happening. But let's get back to the people. Because all of this, the geopolitics, the financial architecture, the strategic calculations, it's easy to talk about in the abstract. Harder to talk about when you zoom in. In Iran, there are cancer patients who can't get chemotherapy because pharmaceutical companies won't risk sanctions violations. In Syria, there are children drinking contaminated water because water treatment facilities can't import the chemicals needed for purification. In Afghanistan, after the US froze the country's foreign reserves, the entire banking system collapsed. People couldn't withdraw their savings. Humanitarian organizations couldn't pay staff. The economy went into freefall. And yes, the Taliban are terrible. Yes, they're repressive and violent and dangerous. But the people starving in Kabul didn't choose the Taliban. They're just trapped. This is the moral knot at the center of sanctions. You want to punish bad actors. You want to create pressure for change. But the people you end up punishing are usually the ones with the least power. And the change you're hoping for, it rarely comes. So what's the alternative? That's the hard part. Because the options aren't great, you could do nothing. Let authoritarian regimes act with impunity. Let human rights abuses go unchallenged. Let aggression go unanswered. Not exactly satisfying. You could use military force. But that's expensive, deadly, unpredictable, And history suggests it often makes things worse. You could use targeted sanctions, freeze the assets of specific individuals, ban them from travel, make their lives uncomfortable without punishing entire populations. And that does happen. But it's not clear how effective it is. Because if you're an oligarch with billions of dollars, losing your vacation home in London is annoying, but it's not regime changing. Some researchers argue for smart sanctions. More precise, more focused. More humanitarian exemptions, but the problem is enforcement. The more exemptions you create, the more loopholes. The harder it is to maintain pressure. Others argue for engagement instead. Keep trading, keep talking. Use economic integration as leverage rather than isolation. But that has its own risks. You can end up enabling bad behavior, funding oppression, legitimizing regimes you should be opposing. There's no clean answer. Here's what we know. Sanctions are a blunt instrument. They cause immense suffering. They rarely achieve their stated goals. And they're politically popular because they let governments look strong without risking much. They're not useless. They can constrain resources. They can signal resolve. They can complicate an adversary's plans. But they're not justice. They're not precision. And they're not free. Every sanction is a calculation. A bet that the pressure will outweigh the pain, that the regime will crack before the population does. A change will come before catastrophe. Sometimes that bet pays off. More often it doesn't. And the people who pay the price are the ones who never placed the bet in the first place. Right now, there are 38 countries under some form of U.S. sanctions. That's more than 20% of the world's population living under economic restrictions they didn't vote for, didn't choose, can't escape. Some of those countries are run by genuinely dangerous regimes. Some are authoritarian nightmares. Some deserve international pressure. But all of them are full of people just trying to live, trying to feed their families, trying to get medicine, trying to survive. And the uncomfortable question nobody wants to answer is this: how many of those people is it acceptable to hurt in the name of geopolitical strategy? How many children die of preventable disease before a sanction becomes indefensible? How many years of economic collapse before you admit the policy isn't working? There's no consensus, no clear line, no easy math, just a global system where the powerful make decisions and the powerless absorb the consequences. And the next time you hear about sanctions being imposed, expanded, or extended, ask yourself, who is this really punishing? And what are we actually trying to achieve? Because the answer might be more complicated than anyone wants to admit.